Hello class. Today we're going to be exploring the lower respiratory tract, which consists of your trachea, aka your windpipe, bronchi, the branches of your windpipe, the lungs, the alveoli, the intercostal muscles, and the diaphragm. We'll have less focus on these two today because those are mainly involved, the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm, in how you breathe, that mechanism by which you draw air into and out of your lungs. So first up is the trachea. Now the trachea is also known as your windpipe, and this lies below your larynx, so right below your Adam's apple, and you can feel on it that there are these bumps. There's a bump every once in a while. Now what those bumps are rings of cartilage. Now, why would you want rings of stiff cartilage all the way along your trachea? Think about it. Think about it, right? If you have a really thick milkshake, let's say you get that triple thick milkshake from McDonald's and you're sucking as hard as you can on the straw, what happens to your straw? Well, your straw will collapse under the pressure. Now, we obviously do not want this to happen, right? When there's that pressure difference that occurs that draws air into your lungs or out of your lungs, you don't want that tube to collapse. That would be a disaster, right? It would stop you from being able to breathe. So we have these rings of cartilage that hold open our windpipe at all times. Now, our windpipe here is going to branch into two branches, and these are the bronchi. There's one to the left and one to the right. Why is that? Where do they branch into? Well, they're going to branch into your lungs. Now, it's important to know that these bronchi, after they branch, they kind of look like trees, right? You have those really thick branches, and then they get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And those smaller and smaller branches we call bronchioles. Now, it's important to know that bronchi and bronchioles are pretty thick cartilage. So they're thick cartilage. Do you think then that gas exchange can occur across that thick layer of cartilage? What do you think? The answer is no, right? No, there isn't going to be gas exchange. When we exchange gases, whether it's oxygen or CO2, we need a very thin membrane between our blood supply and the external environment. And that thick layer of cartilage is not going to allow gas exchange to occur. So that is not where the gas exchange occurs. That's just going to be transporting your respiratory gases. So all of these branches here, you can see that the big branch splits up into the little tiny branches, and those little tiny branches are what we call the bronchioles. Now, you're going to notice that in this photo here of your lungs, you'll notice that there's this little tiny notch here on your left lung. Why do you think there's this notch here? And this notch, by the way, it does make your left lung a little smaller than your right lung. Why is it there? Why is there this notch? Well, what side of your chest does your heart lean on? Well, your heart, it points to the left, right? That is known as the cardiac notch. As a result of that, your left lung is actually only 2 lobes, whereas your right lung has 3 lobes. So your right lung is actually a little bit bigger than your left. Now, as those bronchioles split and split and split, eventually they will terminate in what's called alveoli. Alveoli is where gas exchange actually occurs. And our surface area of our lungs is so great that we often describe it as being about the size of a tennis court. So if we were to take the entire surface area of all of these alveoli and spread them out, it would cover effectively the same area as a tennis court. Now, why do we want this insanely large surface area? Think about it. Why would we want such a big surface area in our lungs? Let me ask this another way. When you breathe out, is there still oxygen left in that air? Yeah, there is, right? That's why CPR kind of works. There's still oxygen left in that air. The reason we have so much surface area is that for every breath, we want to extract as much oxygen as possible and get rid of as much CO2 as possible. So again, here's another photo showing that cardiac notch, that gap in your left lung to help fit the apex of your heart. You can see here clearly the 3 lobes of your right lung and the 2 lobes of your left. So where do these bronchi and bronchioles terminate? Well, they terminate in alveoli, little tiny air sacs. And they are located at the end of bronchioles, and this is where gas exchange occurs. Now, around these alveoli are microscopic capillaries. Capillaries are the smallest blood vessels possible. They're very thin. They're 1 cell thick. And it's through these very thin capillaries and this very thin membrane of your alveoli where gas exchange can occur. It's important to know that oxygen and CO2 here, they're being exchanged by passive transport, right? They're going down their concentration gradients. And the less distance they have to travel, the more easily this diffusion can happen. So it's very important that these membranes are very thin. But that also means that your lungs, as a result, are pretty susceptible to damage, right? That's why we temper the air as we breathe it in through our nose, right? We filter it, we warm it, we moisten it, because, well, our alveoli sacs are very susceptible to damage. And that damage can result in things like fluid building up in your lungs, right? What's a very deadly infection that kills a lot of old people? Pneumonia, right? Pneumonia. If you get an infection in your lower respiratory tract that can cause damage to your alveolar sacs, fluid can leak into them, and you can literally drown on your own bodily fluids because oxygen and CO2 cannot be exchanged. So our alveoli look like little tiny grape-like sacs, right? And those rounded grape-like sacs, that helps increase the surface area further, and you can see the networks of capillaries that surround these alveoli. So the 4 processes of respiration, we know breathing in as just, well, breathing in, but there is a fancy word for it, and that word is ventilation, which makes sense. What's happening in the world right now? We have COVID-19, right? We have an illness, which if it's severe enough, we need to put people on ventilators. Now do you understand? It helps breathe for you. Ventilation, ventilators. External respiration is going to be gas exchange between your external environment, aka your alveoli, and your blood. What do you think internal respiration then is? Well, that's going to be the gas exchange between your blood and the cells of your body. So think about that for a second. What types of gases are being exchanged in your lungs? Right? Let's think about that passive transport for a second. So in your alveolar sacs, you're breathing air in. That air is high in what? It's high in oxygen and it's low in CO2. The blood that's coming from your body to your lungs has been deoxygenated, right? It's low in oxygen and it's picked up CO2 as it's gone through your body. So the blood is high in CO2, low in oxygen. So we have CO2 diffusing into the alveoli, right, down its concentration gradient, and we have oxygen diffusing into the blood. Now the reverse situation is true when we go from the now oxygenated blood to the cells of your body, right? That blood is high in oxygen, low in CO2. The cells are high in CO2, low in oxygen. So again, we have CO2 and oxygen diffusing across their concentration gradients. Now, one of the things that can damage these processes is smoking. Smoking is still one of the leading causes of death in our society, and it does tons of damage to your lungs. In particular, it damages the cleaning system of your lungs, which can then cause destruction of your alveoli. So to review, our upper respiratory tract is from the larynx to the nose, right? It's going to be your nose, nasal cavity, your mouth, your pharynx, the back of the throat, the epiglottis that closes off your trachea, and your larynx, your voice box. That is your upper respiratory tract, right? Mainly, what does that nasal cavity do? It's going to filter, warm and moisten the air and prepare it for your lungs. And your lower respiratory tract is all about getting that air into your alveoli where that gas exchange can occur. Right? So the air is going to pass through your larynx, to your trachea, to your bronchi, then your bronchioles, then your alveoli, those little sacs, and that's where that gas exchange is going to occur. Okay, so let's look at gas exchange in a little bit more detail. Because remember, we need to get oxygen from our external environment and get rid of CO2, that waste product. So in external respiration, gas exchange between your external environment and your blood, we need to transport those gases. And again, how is that done? It's done by simple diffusion. Recall, simple diffusion is going to be the movement of a substance from an area of high concentration to low concentration, and it does not require energy. So what is the first step then? Well, we need to get air in. What's that called? That process is called inspiration, right? Getting air into our lungs. And it's here where that air will contact the surface of our alveoli. Now, it's important to note that here there's higher concentrations of oxygen in the air than in our blood. Therefore, oxygen will move down its concentration gradient, and it is here where we get oxygen into our blood, into our red blood cells. Water is very important here. We cannot dissolve these gases without a very moist membrane. There needs to be water there to facilitate the diffusion of these gases. So what is the next step? Well, we need to get CO2 out, right? We have a higher concentration of CO2 in our blood, so it's going to go down its concentration gradient again from our blood into our lungs. And how do we then get rid of that CO2? Well, we breathe it out in a process called expiration. Right? To breathe in, the sciencey word for that is inspiration. Breathing out is expiration. Here's a little animation where you can see this happening. Right? We have oxygen gas coming in, and as the oxygen gas gets absorbed into one of those red blood cells, you can actually see it change color from dark red to light red. And you can see the carbon dioxide diffusing out here of our red blood cells into the alveolar space. So what about the opposite? What about internal respiration? Well, this is going to happen once that oxygenated blood gets to the tissues of your body. And again, this is going to happen by simple diffusion. So oxygen is transported to the body cells via the bloodstream, the highways of our body. And of course, this is happening by red blood cells, which we will explore in much more detail in the next unit. Now, there's a higher concentration of oxygen in your blood versus your tissues. Therefore, oxygen will move from the blood into your tissues. Right? Oxygen here is going to be moving from your blood cells into your tissues. Now, your tissues are high in CO2. So, therefore, they're going to be moving from your tissues into your blood. And again, this is all happening by simple diffusion. Now, carbon dioxide is carried from the bloodstream back to the lungs where it will be expelled. It is a cycle which, if it breaks down for any significant length of time, you will die. So for tomorrow, we will be exploring the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, and how those work in conjunction to cause you to breathe in and breathe out. But think about that. How is it that you breathe in and you breathe out? That is the question we will be answering tomorrow.